All right, hi everybody. Welcome into the Felger and Maz off-air show brought to you by our friends at Miller Lite. Over 50 years of Miller time starts with a light. The great American Pilsner brings you the Felger and Maz off-air show every week, and this is another special edition of the program as we are joined by author Keith O'Brien, who I have both of his books here. One I read on my own, Charlie Hustle. In the last 6 months or so. I can't remember when I finished it, but a big fan of this book. And I had been talking to Keith for a while, in and around sort of that book. And then he came out with Heartland, which a lot of Celtics fans know now, sort of a story of Larry Bird in his early years, which I have not gotten to yet, Keith. I devoured Charlie Hustle, but I haven't started this one yet. So you can help walk me through. But thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's great to be with you finally.
Okay, Keith. So we'll start with the Larry Bird book before I circle back to some Pete Rose questions I have. Tell me, what are Celtics fans who know Larry Bird well going to learn something new in this book, or does it just give more sort of context to things that we might have already known?
Lots of new stuff in this book. So, this is an origin story of Larry Bird in rural Indiana. My narrative unfolds between 1973 and 1979. Everything after 1979 is epilogue material for me. And that's the way I wanted to write this book. I feel like anytime someone had come to the early story of Larry Bird in the past 50 years, they always did it the same way. We always do the Bird magic story. We weave Bird and magic together and we tell this tried and true tale. And, listen, I understand why we do that. As a sports fan, as a storyteller, I get it. But the reality of the situation is in the 1970s, Bird and Magic barely knew each other. They've met one time before that epic championship game in 1979. They hardly spoke in that one meeting. So they're not friends. They're not rivals. They're not anything. Magic Johnson is no different to Larry Bird than Sidney Moncrief or Mark Aguirre, two NBA stars he also plays that spring. So, really what I've done here with this narrative is tilted the camera a different way, zoomed in on this origin story in rural Indiana in the 70s. And when you do that, you do get an entirely different story. And you also get this entirely different cast of characters who we don't know. These are the people who were around Bird in those days, who do form and shape and at times actually save Larry Bird. And that to me is the story that I'm telling here.
So one thing just from reading reviews and poking around a little bit, it feels that a prominent part of his early story was the death of his father, or the suicide of his father, which is something either I did not know or had forgotten. And it seems to me it really shapes and maybe answers a little bit why Bird was the way that he was, which, to those of us in Boston might be a little standoffish or awkward or insular, maybe a little bit of a mystery. And it feels to me that the death of his father plays prominently in that. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, listen, in 2026, we have a word for this. I mean, we would call it a trauma. I mean, a suicide is a trauma for a family. It's a trauma for a community. It's incredibly difficult to overcome today, even with resources and a safety net and caregivers. None of that exists for Larry Bird in February 1975 when his father takes his own life. Bird that winter is 18 years old. He's just turned 18. He is separate from his father's tragic death, is in the middle, Larry is, of the worst winter of his life. He's nearly slipping away entirely. This is the moment when we nearly lose Larry Bird forever. He is, at that point, has graduated from high school at Springs Valley High in French Lick. He has briefly played for Bobby Knight at Indiana for 3 weeks before he quits there. He comes home, he enrolls in vocational school, not a JUCO program, not a community college, a voc school, and he plays basketball there. Then he quits that school, and it's at that point that his father takes his life. And in the weeks after that trauma, Larry is telling his mother that he's not going back to college. She is running off recruiters who are coming. Recruiters have gotten the message, by the way. Nobody is writing stories about Larry Bird in the spring of 1975. He is gone. No one cares. And really, this is the moment, the first sort of moment, sliding doors moment for Larry Bird, where things could have gone completely differently as a result.
Can you just give us a quick background on what his father did for a living? How did he get into the state that he was, where he took his own life? And his parents were separated. Larry Bird's parents were separated at the time. Just a little more color on that.
Yeah, sure. So I did a lot of work actually to try to render Larry's father, Joey Bird, in three dimensions on the pages of the book, because over the years, it's sort of a one-off. It's a line. It's a moment that's rarely explored. And so I spent a lot of time in French Lick, getting to know people who knew Joey Bird. That was number one. Number two, Joey Bird served. He's a veteran, a naval veteran of World War II, and an Army veteran of the Korean War. And over the years, there were whispers in French Lick, some of which were repeated, that Joey struggles as a result of his military service, and that's why he descends into drinking, descends into alcoholism. That's why he struggles. And I wanted to know if it was true, because as a journalist over the years, this is a trope almost that some people with problems will trot out to explain why they are struggling when really they didn't see combat at all. So I tracked down Joey Bird's military records. And in the 40s, he does serve in World War II aboard a naval ship. But it's at the end of the war. Joey Bird is a crew messman. He's serving food below deck. He is not in combat. So, that left me curious. But then the Korean records came in. Joey Bird is in Korea in 1950 and 1951. This is some of the bloodiest months of the war. The Americans are taking great losses. We are retreating back towards Seoul that winter. Joey Bird is serving with the 25th Infantry. He's in foxholes in the snow. I know for a fact that he saw and maybe did terrible things because, while I was in French Lick, Michael, I spent a lot of time in the French Lick Public Library. And down in the basement there is the local newspaper, the Springs Valley Herald. This can only be found in French Lick. It's not digitized. It's nowhere else. It's in these giant books. And I had to flip through it page by page, just looking for nuggets about his father. And then in the spring of 51, while Joey is still in Korea, there it was. He writes home, a first-person account of that winter. And it stopped me cold. I must have looked at it 4 times, wondering, if that was really written by Joey Bird, and it was. So all of this is in his background. He comes back to French Lick. He quickly marries Larry's mother, Georgia Bird. They have 4 children in 4.5 years. And really the struggles begin right then. And by the 70s, Joey is jumping from job to job. He's a wood finisher by trade. He's held down jobs at the Kimball piano plant, which was in French Lick in those days. He's held down jobs at a kitchen cabinetry factory over in Jasper, Indiana. But he's lost those jobs. He's struggling. He can't afford to pay the child support that he is legally required to pay. And it is in that moment that he sadly and tragically takes his own life.
So this was after Larry had left Indiana. So he was back home. So the father's suicide didn't play into him coming back from Indiana. Is that simply as, and again, maybe people know the story, maybe people don't. Is this strictly because Bobby Knight's an asshole and Larry Bird doesn't want to play for Bobby Knight? Was that pretty much what happened there?
It's a bit more complex than that. In some ways, Knight sets Bird up for success. Based on my reporting, Bird is living for those 3 weeks at a dormitory called McNutt Quad, All of the basketball players were in that dorm. There are 42 years of NBA service moving into that dorm in August 1974. There's 37,000 future NBA points moving into that dorm. Larry is with his people. And by the way, his high school girlfriend, who he is soon to marry, is living right next door in another dormitory. She's right there. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, this could have worked. But, you're right. I mean, listen, Knight's big problem here is the problem that, by the way, is going to bring down Pete Rose, too. It's hubris. Knight knows that team is good. That Hoosiers team without Bird is going to go 63-1 over the next 2 seasons. They're going to lose 1 game in 2 years without Larry Bird. They've got future number 1 overall draft picks in that locker room without Larry Bird. And the fact of the matter is, Bird was not considered a top 15 recruit in the state of Indiana in 1974. In the state of Indiana, he was not top 15. So Knight has signed him, but it's not clear that he totally believes in him. The guys in that locker room don't believe in him. I know that from my reporting. And, Larry feels alone. He feels poor. He feels lost. And I pinpointed, by the way, the exact day that Larry Bird leaves Bloomington. It's a Friday, September 13th, 1974. Larry walks in to the offices of assistant coach Dave Bliss, a man who knew Larry better than Bobby. And Larry says he's gone, he's leaving. And Dave Bliss knows that when Bird says something, he means it. But Bobby Knight has misjudged the man and the moment once again on that Friday night. Bobby Knight's not on campus. He's a couple hours north in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where he's given a talk at the Marriott. People are paying $25 at the door to listen to the great Bobby Knight tell stories. Meanwhile, maybe the best player who could have ever played for the Hoosiers has walked out to Highway 37, and Larry Bird is hitchhiking home.
Keith, so if Larry Bird wasn't a top 15 recruit in Indiana, and then, not just 5 years later, he's one of the best players in the NBA, did he get better? Did he get with a coach, or did something happen that made him a better player, or was he just underrated or undiscovered?
It's mostly the latter. Of course, Larry Bird's going to get better. His improvement during his time in college is exponential. But it is mostly a failure of scouting, a failure of recruiting, a failure of stereotypes. Bird, plays in French Lick for Springs Valley High School. This is a high school that's incredibly small and a tiny remote town. They don't play big schools. They don't play city schools. They play schools like Shoals and Paoli and Orleans, other small schools. So Larry Bird has put up these epic numbers as a high school senior. Only one great year in high school, by the way. One great year of epic numbers, and people don't believe. They don't believe in it. They think he's overrated and those statistics are inflated because he's played to other tiny schools. And listen, I think the other stereotype that works against Larry here in this moment, but actually will help him later, is Larry's white. He's white. And, at points that spring, other big schools peel off of Larry, including the University of Kentucky, because they don't think he's fast enough, he's agile enough to compete at the highest levels of college basketball. And so for those reasons, Larry Bird sort of slips through the cracks.
So from what I understand, Larry Bird did not agree to be interviewed for your book. Do you know why?
I don't know why. I made great efforts to try to get him, both through...
Did you ever speak to him, like off the record, just to talk to him?
No, I did not. One thing I'll say, sort of a difference between Pete Rose and Larry Bird. Pete Rose was who I did interview. It was incredibly undisciplined in his life in lots of ways. And I got to Pete for a while, 27 hours of recorded interviews until he stopped calling me back, until he shut down. probably because of advice he got from his agent. Larry is incredibly disciplined. I said a minute ago, Dave Bliss knew that Larry was serious in 1974 when he walked in and said he was leaving. Larry still does what he says he's going to do and doesn't do what he says he won't do. I mean, he still does that. And I tried through the front door, through his agent, through proper channels, couldn't get to him that way. And then I did get quite close with Larry Bird's closest friends. And I don't mean Danny Ainge or Kevin McHale. I mean the guys that Larry Bird is closest to today, right now, the people he's texting.
Who are they?
Well, they're people in Indiana who aren't famous. Some live in Terre Haute, who sort of came of age with him there at Indiana State. Some are down in French Lick and have known him for decades. I did get close with those folks. I know they were advocating on my behalf. I don't know why he didn't call me back. But this story is bigger than Larry. This is an origin story, like I said, but really this is a story of a team, a time, a moment. That moment in 1979, where Bird finally sort of explodes onto the national stage as a college senior and leads Indiana State to this 33-0 season, steamrolling into that final game, is one of the great Cinderella stories of all time. And I did speak with almost every other person who was part of that team, part of that moment, part of that time.
Keith O'Brien, again, the author of Heartland here. If you're just joining us midstream here, Keith. So he exploded on the national scene in 79, but he was drafted the year before by the Celtics, right? So what did and how did Auerbach and the Celtics get to see what the world did not?
77, 78 is Larry's sort of coming out party. He is an All-American in the spring of 78. He's gone back-to-back seasons of averaging roughly 30 points a game. But Indiana State doesn't make the NCAA tournament. Indiana State doesn't play on national TV. Almost no one has seen Larry Bird, play. They've seen his photograph, maybe. Auerbach had only seen him once, personally. Obviously, he had scouts in the Midwest who were feeding him reports, but personally had only seen Larry play one time. But Auerbach, as Celtics fans know, as you know, he's a bit of a savvy genius. And that's a really bad Celtics team in the spring of 78. Auerbach knows it and starts selling off parts starting in January of that year. And he's trading for anything. By the spring, he's got 2 top 10 draft picks, 2. And so he's got some capital to play with. And, he takes Bird with the 6th pick. After 5 teams pass on him, including the Indiana Pacers. I mean, think about that for a second. There's a world where Larry Bird never leaves Indiana. The whole story is different. Indiana won't take him because Bird has made it clear that he intends to return for his senior year, even though he's not getting paid any money to do so. But Auerbach is willing to wait. And he says something that, honestly, I think this is a lesson for life. Forget about sports, forget about Auerbach, forget about Bird. I honestly think this is a lesson for life. When he takes Bird, there's a lot of shrugging of shoulders and questions. Frankly, the Boston media isn't thrilled by this selection. But Auerbach says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that a year goes by faster than people think. Time moves faster than people think, and he believes that folks will regret 1 year later that they didn't take a chance on Larry Bird, and he is right about that because it is that next season where Bird's greatness becomes apparent to all, where NBC has to put him on national TV for the first time, where Indiana State does make that NCAA tournament. And now not only is everybody seeing him, but the largest television audience to ever watch a basketball game is seeing him. And Auerbach, owns Larry Bird's rights.
Keith, is there one Celtic scout who's, credited with discovering him or pushing Red to draft him?
No, there isn't. In the 70s, as you know, it was all of these sports were much less polished, much less professional than they are today. It wasn't like you had, scouts assigned to certain conferences or certain states or regions. I mean, it was a little slapdash, not just for the Celtics, but for lots of NBA teams. And remember, the NBA is dying. It is in '78. When Auerbach drafts Bird, almost anything you can imagine was more popular on television than the NBA. I'm talking about, professional bowling, amateur boxing, winter sports, soap operas, reruns. I mean, everything draws better ratings than the NBA. And one reason why the Pacers don't take Bird is because the Pacers themselves are dying. Unlike the Celtics, they don't feel like they can wait a year for a potential savior because maybe the Pacers don't even exist 1 year later. So it is just a different world, a different time.
So, Keith, I know the last question is on this book is kind of out of the scope of the book, but one thing that has interested me over the years is that I feel Larry Bird really has no attachment to Boston or, frankly, the Celtics. I think I just don't feel any emotional connection. Like there's so many great Celtics over the years that are just part of the organization, part of the city. They're always around, whether, again, it's Havlicek or Cowens or, I don't know if those are the perfect examples, but Pierce. There's guys that are just in the orbit, constantly around. They're Celtics. You can feel it. Larry Bird, to me, it felt like when 92 was done, he was done, and he only came back when he was required to. He obviously does the retirement thing with Magic, and he's had a moment or two, but it doesn't feel to me like he really needs anything to do with this place or that team. Kind of like Brady and the Patriots. But anyway, I just, without having started to read the book yet, is that a Boston thing or is that a Bird thing? In other words, if he were drafted by the Detroit Pistons, would he be doing the same thing with the Detroit Pistons? Once it's over, I'm out, I'm going back to Indiana, and it's not a Boston thing at all, it's a Bird thing.
Great question, Michael. And I got to say, it's the first time anyone's asked me that question. It is a Bird thing, 100% a Bird thing. Not only has Bird sort of divorced himself from the Celtics, he's divorced himself from the Pacers. He's divorced himself from Terre Haute. He's divorced himself from French Lick. Last year, during that epic Indiana Pacers run where they come within one game of winning the NBA title, think about those games we saw on TV, the Pacers arena, all the old faces, Reggie Miller sitting right there, others in the building. There was no Bird. 2 years ago, Indiana State, has its first great season since 1979. They win 32 games. They go to the NIT championship game. No Bird. These days, I spend a lot of time in French Lick. People used to see him there all the time. He was such a regular presence. It was almost ordinary. Nobody looked twice, when they saw Larry Bird in French Lick in the 1980s. He's gone from there too. So I really do think it's a Bird thing. And listen, he said it out loud. For a long time as the head coach and then president of the Pacers, he was required, to talk to the media, to, answer phone calls from people like you and me. From the moment he stepped down from that job, he has completely disappeared. And it's almost like, he wanted to disappear 50 years ago from the moment the spotlight found him in the winter, spring of '78. And I feel like it's like he finally did that.
He spends a lot of time in Naples, Florida, still? Do we know?
Yep, he's down in Florida in the winter, and he has a big sprawling ranch in Indiana where he spends his spring, summer, and fall. And, I've talked to people who spend a lot of time at that ranch, who go to that ranch, who see Larry when he's back in Indiana. And I've been told that there are some summers when Larry arrives there at that ranch and scarcely leaves the property one time.
How old is he now?
He'll be celebrating his 70th birthday later this year. It'll be
And
interesting
how?
if he returns to Terre Haute for that, because I know they're planning to throw like some kind of party for him in December of this year in Terre Haute.
How's his health, as far as we know?
As far as I know, it's good. I mean, based on the people I've talked to, I have no information that suggests otherwise.
Okay. Can you give me 5 minutes on this?
Oh, we'll talk about Pete Rose as long as you want.
Charlie Hustle. This is okay again by Keith O'Brien as well. Love this book. Love the story of Pete Rose because I have a little bit of a personal obsession, I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory, but something I've always believed. I still believe it. You don't really go there in this book. So I'm going to ask you now.
Yeah.
I've always believed that Pete Rose bet against the Cincinnati Reds point blank, and that Giamatti never really wanted to go there. Dowd never really wanted to go there. Vincent subsequently never really wanted to go there. I don't know if you wanted to go there or not, but everyone just sort of, they got enough on him without that final piece. But I'm just of the belief, Keith, that if you're a degenerate gambler and you have a serious gambling problem, you're a gambleaholic, you are that. As Pete did, you will lose, you will go into debt, and there's only one way out of that debt, and that is to bet against yourself. And I just cannot believe he didn't get to that point. He got to every other point. I just believe he ultimately got to that final point, and I just want your thoughts on that.
I love this conspiracy theory. It is a fascinating rabbit hole to explore. And listen, what I've learned about Pete Rose is you never say never. Nothing will ever surprise me. Anything that comes out of the woodwork in the years to come won't surprise me. Based on my reporting, he didn't bet against the Reds. With the caveat being this, there are limited written records of Rose's bets. There's a batch of written records that were turned over to Dowd by one of the guys in Rose's inner circle in 87 and 88. Based on those written records, he doesn't bet against the Reds. There's a second batch that emerges later that predates the first batch. These come from 86. Rose is still a player that spring. He always said till the end of his life, I never bet on baseball until I was done. That's fundamentally not true. My reporting makes that 100% clear. Rose is betting while he's a player. But in that batch of records too, there's no games in which he is betting against the Reds. What's really interesting to me though is this. Based on my reporting, it was almost a decade earlier, 1978, the first time that Major League Baseball intervenes to talk to Rose about his gambling. It's sometime in the spring of 78. This is an epic summer that Rose is about to have. He's going to go on that 44-game hit streak that year, the longest hit streak since Joe DiMaggio 80 years ago. And that spring, the head of security for Major League Baseball, a former FBI agent, meets with Rose and Reds ownership in the offices there at Riverfront Stadium before a game to talk to Rose about his gambling. Again, I can't prove it. I do sort of wonder if that intervention was because Rose was already betting on baseball. That's a conspiracy theory that's out there as well. But listen, you go down these rabbit holes with Pete, it gets very dark, it gets very gnarly, and lots of things are possible.
That's right. I mean, he is associating with known cocaine dealers, steroid gyms, betting on everything under the sun. He is not just a womanizer, but some questionable relationships there. So it's like he had no governor on he didn't stop short on anything. Now he's going to say, you know what? I'm going to stand on principle and I will never bet against. I just don't believe it. So look, the betting slips are what the betting slips say. Maybe there's others that are thrown in the toilet in the trash, and we'll never see him or whatever. But I just can't believe that he had so many problems and was such a degenerate in so many ways and never stopped at anything. He was going to stop at that. I find that hard to believe. But I still, Keith, even if that's the case, there were obviously cases where he would use his closer one night but not the next, or use his pitching staff a certain way one night and not the next. So even if he didn't bet against the Reds, effectively, if you're one of the gamblers who knows how he's betting, or you bet one night and didn't bet the next, you can sort of play along with Pete, and whether he's technically betting against him or not, for all intents and purposes, you knew when he wasn't.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that, because I think this is true, lock solid, and a real problem. Rose told me in the times that we met, and he told others over the year, I always bet, on my team, which again, based on the records, and by the way, my interviews with 3 different men who placed Rose's bets with those bookies, 3 runners, essentially, some of which hate Pete Rose. Even they said he never bet against them. But, what is clear is that, as you said, there were nights where he didn't bet at all. So he's betting on the Reds on Monday and Tuesday. He doesn't bet on Wednesday. Then he's back on them on Thursday and Friday, but not for the weekend. And these days, it's different. We're all betting on our phones. It's a totally different world. In those days, the runners, or at times Pete Rose himself, are placing the call to the bookie. And bookies didn't live in a vacuum. If I'm a bookie in Cincinnati, most of my clientele are betting for the Reds on their team. And so right before game time, at around 7 o'clock before a 7:05 game, I'm calling my bookie friend in Chicago or New York, and I'm laying off my bets with him, and he's laying off his Mets bets or their Cubs bets with me, so that we all come out even. And you don't come out even because I'm taking 10%. I'm taking the VIG on all the bets anyway. That's what smart bookies did. That's what almost every bookie did. And a lot of these bookies worked in syndicates where it was just part of the system. So you can 100% guarantee that when those layoff calls were being made around 6:55, 10 minutes before first pitch, folks were saying, who does Rose have tonight? Because who knows more about that night's game between the Reds and the Mets than the manager of the Cincinnati Reds? So on nights, I assure you, when Rose had no action on the Reds, those bookies, those syndicates, other guys out there, some tied to the mob without question, were putting money against the Reds and likely winning big as a result. And so this is true. This is the problem with Rose's, comments over the years. You start placing bets on sports when you're in the clubhouse, it gets messy fast.
So I'd say again, without having started the Bird book, I'd say a commonality is how their backstory, their origin story, informs us about who they are. Bird and the suicide of his father, I think, explains a lot about his emotional detachment to so many things. And you would have to assume it goes back to that. Pete Rose grew up at the track. His father was at the racetrack constantly, as you detail here. He met his first wife at the track. The neighborhood that he grew up in was just a big gambling neighborhood. They were at the racetrack all the time, and it was sort of in Charlie Rose's blood, correct?
Absolutely, in Pete Rose's blood. I mean, he was born to gamble, and he was addicted to gambling. Back to your point, Pete would, over the years, he only said that twice, that he was addicted, and in both cases, it was in a self-serving moment. He says it in 1990 in front of a judge before his sentencing for tax evasion, trying to gain some kind of favor with the court. And he says it in that mealy-mouthed, memoir, that he wrote 20 years ago, in which he reversed himself on 15 years of lies and said, finally, yeah, I bet on baseball. Those were 2 times where he indicated that he was addicted. Listen, like I said, I not only did I interview 3 men who were in his inner circle who placed those bets for Rose, I interviewed everybody who was in his inner circle in the 1970s and 80s. Those guys in that, that Gold's Gym in Cincinnati where steroids and cocaine, were moving through the bathroom. The guys at the racetrack, who were his consigliaries. Everybody who had a front row seat to Pete Rose in the 70s and 80s said the same thing. He was a gambling addict. He couldn't stop. As one of his best friends told me, by 1985-86, Rose was like a 747 spiraling out of the sky. There was no way to stop it.
Okay. Keith, we'll cut it there. Keith O'Brien, author of Charlie Hustle, Pete Rose biography, and the new book, Heartland, on Larry Bird. Should be keen interest to people in Boston. Keith, thanks so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
So much fun, man. Thanks for having me.